Lesson, Erik Brandt.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I come from a Scandinavian background. On my father's side, it's Swedish. On my mother's side, it's Norwegian. And I remember as a kid, we had some relatives, some distant relatives come to our house. And they sat in our living room, and my parents asked them about their travels. And to this day, I remember what they said. They said, "Travel is good, but home is best." Some of you may have gone on some journeys this summer or are going to take some journeys. Maybe you'll travel to see relatives. Maybe you'll travel to some other country. Maybe you will visit relatives that you've never seen before. It'll take you away from home for a while, and you'll maybe meet new people. You'll eat new foods. Maybe you'll be in a land where you have to use a phrase book, or where you have to find some signs that are written in your own language. And there is certainly a lot to learn when you live in other cultures. But still, home is best. What was that program where it says, we all want to be where everyone knows your name? Cheers. There is something about being at home, about being with your own kid, about being with your people. Some people would say being in your own hood. You're at home. You're where you feel you ought to be. And it seems as if there is a deep desire in each of us to be at home. And so it has been for God's people throughout the generations. Sometimes God has taken his people away from home. But he has always promised. He has said, I will bring you back home. And in today's lesson, I want for us to look at how God has brought his people home through generations. And I want to look at the people, God's people, looking at the story that we find in the books of the Old Testament. Not the whole story of Israel, but a good chunk of it. I've distributed copies of a paper to you, the history of Israel from Abraham to exile. If you've not received a copy of this, please raise your hand, and our brother will give you a copy of it. And this is for your reference. Our Wednesday night Bible class at Silver Spring has been going through a series of lessons on New Testament backgrounds. And what we discovered in this class is that the background of the New Testament begins in the Old Testament. And while, yes, we are New Testament Christians, we live under the Old Covenant, I always say, well, but it's so important to know the Old Testament as well. You cannot fully understand the New Testament until you grasp the story of the Old Testament. So we're going to go on a whirlwind tour over a big chunk of the Old Testament today. It'll be a review for many of you, but it will show us how God has brought his people home and how he continues to do that. And sometimes God's people are wondering how God is going to do that. Let's see the story of God bringing his people home. starting with Abraham. Now at the top left hand of your little sheet, it says, start here. Now hopefully in the next few minutes, I forgot to turn on my little timer. I have my little timer here to warn me when this is my little Toastmasters timer, with a green light, a yellow light, and a red light to warn me when the time is got. So you'll allow me to yield those 2 or 3 minutes I used in that introduction, I trust. So hopefully in the next few minutes we're going to somehow get from where it says start here to end here. But notice at the end of the story it says stay tuned, because the story continues. But at least we'll cover a few hundred years of history in the next few minutes. The story begins, of course, in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and you could say the story is from everlasting to everlasting because God has existed from everlasting and will exist to everlasting. But God created the heavens and the earth, and He created human beings. He created man in His own image. And eventually He called Abraham. He called Abraham, and we're starting in the Old Testament book of Genesis. The call of Abraham you can find in Genesis chapter 12. If you wish to follow in the Old Testament, you're welcome to do so. But this is pretty much an overview. God comes to Abraham and says, I will bless you, and I will make you into a great nation. Your descendants will number greater than the number of grains of sand on the seashore. How this was going to happen, Abraham did not know. But God miraculously makes it possible for him to have children. And God repeats this promise to his son Isaac and to Jacob, Abraham's grandson. Now we remarked in our Wednesday night class that we often don't think of Jacob as Abraham's grandson. But when you see the generations and you see how people are connected, you see an unfolding story of God's family. Now, of course, Jacob's other name is Israel. And that's an important thing to remember, as we see that Jacob's sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we often think it's not good to play favorites, but we do learn that Jacob's favorite son, Israel's favorite son, was, are you following on the sheet? It was Joseph. Now, Joseph wasn't very loved by his brothers. And they made a plot, and they sold Joseph into slavery. They tossed him into a well, a cistern or something like that. And he was sold into slavery in Egypt. But in Egypt, God caused Joseph to prosper. And he made Joseph second only to Pharaoh. Now, Joseph was taken away from home, taken into a land far away from his home. But God had a plan, ultimately, to bring his people home. We're going to see that often the pathway home is often quite circuitous. It's often not direct. It often brings God's people through foreign and strange lands, encountering various trials of various kinds. One of these trials in the time of Joseph was a famine. There was a famine that strikes the region, and Jacob's sons travel to Egypt for food, not knowing that they would find Joseph there. And while they were there, Joseph disguises himself and causes his brothers perhaps some, shall we say, stress when he tells them to go back and get their youngest son Benjamin. And they say, well, if we do that, our father will die because he doesn't have anyone else, and he's already lost one of his sons. But Joseph insists, and so they go, and as they say, to make a long story short, eventually Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and he says, I am your son Joseph, I am your brother Joseph. I am Joseph, the one that you sold into slavery. But Joseph forgives his brothers and invites them to Egypt. And they live in the land of Goshen. And they are saved from famine. And Jacob is reunited with his son. And he lives with his children. And it says that the people of Israel become numerous in Egypt. But then there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And the Pharaoh started fearing that the number of the people of Israel would become so numerous that they would take over the land of Egypt. And so Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites and instituted taskmasters over them. And he said to the midwives to kill all the newborn males. And Moses, the prophet Moses, is born into Egypt. And his mother fears for the life of his son. And she puts him in a basket, which is covered with bitumen and pitch. I think I know what pitch is. I'm not so sure about bitumen. Do we have any carpenters here? At any rate, it's something that I imagine is watertight. But still, when you put a baby in a basket in the bulrushes near a river, you are doing something that requires a lot of faith. There was hope that this baby would be rescued somehow. And sure enough, Pharaoh's daughter comes along and discovers this baby in the basket. And Moses' sister happened to be by and said, hey, look, how would you like someone to nurse this child? And sure enough, Pharaoh's daughter says, yes. And so they call the mother of Moses, and she nurtures this baby. And then the baby is brought to Pharaoh's daughter and becomes Pharaoh's, well, it is brought into their family. And Moses grows up in Egypt, and eventually he is called by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery through the desert to the promised land. And Moses says, well, how am I going to do that? I'm not a speaker. I'm not a leader. But God says, I will appoint Aaron for you, and he will speak on your behalf. The responsibilities that Moses had to lead God's people were enormous. And he had an uncle who came to him and, look, you need to appoint some people who will help you in this task of governing the people of Israel. Now, in the process of wandering through the desert, they come to Mount Sinai, where God reveals the law to Moses. Moses met with God face to face on Mount Sinai. He would come down from the mountain and his face was glowing. He shone with the glory of the Lord and even had to cover his face with a veil. But even in the process of God revealing the law to Moses, the people were already starting to make idols, starting to create a golden calf. And Moses comes down with the law on the tablets and can't believe what they are doing at the base of the mountain. And he throws the tablets down and says, this cannot be. It turns out the nation of Israel are then taken on a route of wandering through the desert. They don't take a direct, non-stop flight from Washington National to the Promised Land. They take a long route through the desert, wandering, where they don't have the food that they ate in Egypt. They don't have the clothing that they had in Egypt. But somehow God provides for them. He provides manna in the desert. He provides plenty of quail that they could ever eat. And somehow he provides them enough clothing and shoes or sandals for their feet so that they are able to make this long journey. But the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years. They are not home yet. They wander. But eventually they reach the plains of Moab, outside of Canaan. And Moses pronounces blessings. He goes up onto Mount Ebal and he says that when you go into possession of the land, if you obey the Lord and you follow his commandments, you will be blessed. If you disobey God, you will be cursed. There will be many consequences for disobedience if you choose not to obey the covenant that God has made for you. But remember this, if you disobey God, you will be expelled from the land. But if you return to God, he will restore you to the promised land. And so this is a theme that is set up throughout Scripture, that God will take you home. God will take us home. God will restore us to the promised land. But disobedience has its consequences as well. Now, as they were scouting out the promised land, they discovered that there were some very big people in the promised land, some giants. As they were scouting the people, as they were scouting out through the land, they said, yes, the land is a very bountiful land with milk and honey and wonderful fruit. But in Canaan there were lots of people like the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites and the Hivites and a lot of other ites. And a lot of people were afraid. They says, well, they're warrior people. But there were two people, Joshua and Caleb, said, no, the land is wonderful, it is beautiful, it is plenteous. We can enter this land. We can conquer the land because the Lord is with us. And because God saw the courage of Joshua and Caleb, they said, yes, Joshua and Caleb will enter the land. They will take possession of the land. But Moses died outside of Canaan. He did not set foot into the promised land. Now, once Joshua and Caleb and the Israelites enter into the promised land, Joshua eventually dies. And it says, once Joshua died, the next generation started living in a way that was disobedient. And it's set into a cycle where the people would disobey God, and God would allow an enemy to oppress them, would raise up an enemy, and then people would cry out to God to be delivered from this enemy. It said God would raise up a judge to deliver his people. And for a period of time, peace would ensue. But as there was peace and prosperity, the people would once again start worshiping the Baals, would turn their hearts towards other gods, and the cycle would be repeated. This happened again and again for some 300 years. Now, eventually, the people said, when the prophet Samuel came, they came to Samuel and they said, "We want a king like the other nations." And Samuel warned them. They say, "Now look, if you get a king, you realize that there will be consequences. If you get a king, the king will take." Now, we had a sermon about that. Does anybody remember something about hits and hugs, where kings appointed by God will give, others not appointed by God will take. But the people of Israel insist, and God says to Samuel, "Go ahead, anoint a king." And so Samuel anoints the first king of Israel, Saul. And Saul is followed by David and then Solomon. And this is the period of time known as the United Monarchy, or the United Kingdom. Now, once Solomon passed, there were 10 tribes that broke away from the tribes of Judah and the tribes of Benjamin. The tribes of Benjamin and Judah formed the southern kingdom known as Judah in the south, and the other 10 tribes formed the kingdom of Israel in the north. The northern kingdom is known for its following after other gods. In Scripture it says, "The kings of Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord." And God caused the people of Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, to come up against the nation of Israel. And in 722 BC, Assyria invaded Israel and took people captive into the Assyrian Empire, scattering them throughout the empire of Assyria, never to return once again to Israel. In the southern kingdom of Judah, there were some kings who were faithful. Some did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Some kings were faithful in the eyes of the Lord. And so the kingdom of Judah existed for some time longer than the northern kingdom of Israel. About 612 BC, God rose up the empire of Babylon. And Babylon conquers Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. And so they then become the leading empire in that region. And in 605 BC, they come to Jerusalem and they remove Daniel and others from the royal family from Jerusalem and take them to Babylon. Daniel becomes part of the royal household. Babylon institutes Jehoiakim as a king in Jerusalem, And so we see two other times where Babylon invades Jerusalem. In 597 BC, Babylon reinvades and then sacks the temple. Nebuchadnezzar puts Zedekiah on the throne. But eventually Zedekiah rebels against Babylon, and in 586 BC, Babylon invades a third time, captures Jerusalem, burns the temple, destroys the city walls, and then they appoint Gedaliah as a governor in Jerusalem. There's a man named Ishmael who assassinates Gedaliah. A man named Jehonan is worried how the Babylonian Empire is going to respond to this act. And so he pursues Ishmael, but does not capture him. And then, in fear of what the Babylonians will do, he seeks to find an alliance with Egypt. But Jeremiah warns that if he relies on Egypt, surely he will be killed. And sure enough, the Babylonians eventually attack Egypt, and the Jews who sought refuge there are killed. And so begins 70 years of Babylonian captivity. God's people are brought away from home. They are, even as Moses had warned, that disobedience will lead to being expelled from the land, yet there was a promise that eventually God would bring them back into the land. And so after 70 years of Babylonian captivity, the wonder was, who will take us back? Will God bring us back to Jerusalem? Will God take us back home? Who will do that? And sure enough, God provides someone who will release God's people from Babylonian captivity. Now, if I were playing the role of a television announcer, I would say, will God's people return to their places or to their homeland? Who will release them from captivity? Stay tuned. Tune in next time, and you will discover what has happened. Or we would say, this will be continued on the next blog post. But I'll give you a hint, because the story is open. And what we discover is at the close of the Old Testament. Now, let me ask you this. Who here can tell me who God rose up to deliver his people, to allow them to return to Jerusalem? Who knows their Old Testament history?
King Cyrus.
Cyrus, okay. Cyrus of Persia. So the Persian Empire overwhelms Babylon. Now, a number of weeks ago, there was an exhibit at the Sackler Gallery of Art, the Cyrus Cylinder. Did anybody get a chance to see this exhibit? Well, it was a proclamation of Cyrus to allow people to go back to their homelands. And now, unfortunately, we missed it. I learned about it after the fact. I learned about it after I started teaching my class on New Testament backgrounds. But if you're really eager to see it, you can go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and see it. Until August 5th. So you have to act quickly. Now, our class on Wednesday night is actually going to take a trip to the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, because they have some other archaeological finds to discover. It's a major archaeological museum, so we're going to look at what they have to say about Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire, the Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian empires, and Egyptian empires. They have major things on that. So we're actually taking a trip from on August 10th. So if anybody would like to take a trip to the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology with a group from Silver Spring, let me know and I'll give you the details. So I see that my Toastmasters timer is saying it's time to wrap this up. But I want for us to think about this idea of home and how God will take us home. Sometimes He takes us through circuitous routes and we wonder, who will deliver us? Now ultimately, our home is not here on this earth. We sing the song, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." However much at home we may feel here, there is still a sense that, no, this isn't where I ultimately belong. There is some longing to be at home with God, where we see Him face to face, where we will be provided for, where there will be no more parting, sorrow, tears. Our perishable bodies will be replaced with imperishable bodies, and we will, even as Moses saw God face to face, maybe not in His full glory, but at least a portion of God's glory, we will see the Lord face to face. And so we sing songs such as "Home of the Soul," "Beautiful Home, There We Shall Rest," "Never to Roam," "Free from All Care," "Happy and Bright," "Jesus is There, He is the Light," "Oft in the Storm Lonely Are We," "Sighing for Home," "Longing for Thee," "Beautiful Home," "The Ransom Beside the Crystal Sea." We sing songs like, "Lead me gently home, Father, lead me gently home, lest I fall upon the wayside, lead me gently home." There's this longing for home. And then we sing songs like, "To Canaan's land, I'm on my way, where the soul never dies. No sad farewells, no tear-dimmed eyes, where all is love and the soul never dies." This is our longing. We long for home. And the good news is that God will lead us home. And He promises to call us home, even as the Father looked for the Son, His lost Son, who had gone a long way from home and squandered all that He had no food, wanted to eat what the pigs were eating, but eventually said, "In my Father's house, even the servants are well taken care of. I will arise and I will go to my Father and I will say, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." Yet all this time, the Father was longing for His Son to come home. And when he saw Him even afar off, He said, "Let us throw a party. My son who is lost is now coming home." And so we have a God who longs for us to come home, to be reconciled with Him, to be in His kingdom, so that He can provide for us and that we can fellowship with Him and with our brothers and sisters, the family of God. Can you imagine meeting Moses? Can you imagine meeting all of these people that we've learned about? What would it be like to meet Joshua and Caleb? I wonder what they're like. You can imagine what that will be like. But most of all, to see Jesus. And so, if this lesson has touched you in some way, and if you have a prayer while we are in this foreign land, there is trouble, but God says, "Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." He has given us the Holy Spirit as a first fruits, as a promise of this time where we will see Him face to face. We know that where 2 or 3 are gathered, God is there in the midst, and so prayer is one way for us to connect with God, even though we do not see Him but through a glass darkly. So if there is a desire for someone to, if there is any need, please make that need known as we stand and sing.